This is not a World Cup that appears to be governed by a human rights framework. Ahead of the Club World Cup 1 year before, FIFA canceled its own anti-racism and anti-discrimination campaigns.
Every country has human rights challenges. However, when it comes to countries that have significant gaps, there is opportunity.
Hi there, and welcome to Voices from the Institute for Human Rights in Business, also known as IHRB. I am Deborah Sago, and in this podcast, you'll hear from people working to make respect for human rights part of everyday business. You've just heard from Mary Harvey from the Centre for Sport and Human Rights and Minky Worden from Human Rights Watch. With the World Cup heading towards the final in North America, this episode explores the relationship between football and human rights and the role of business. Let's hear from my colleague Salil Tripathi, who spoke to Mary and Minky about this. Salil, why did you want to talk about this now?
Well, it is the biggest sporting event in the world, right? World Cup football. More people watch it, or World Cup soccer if you're an American. More people watch it than almost any other sporting event, probably even Olympics included. Everybody is riveted by what's going on the ground and off the ground, as we notice from the Cup this year. But far less attention tends to get put on human rights when we are talking about it. And it's such a global tournament, and there are many human rights aspects, so I wanted to explore that further. It's also important for business because the World Cup is a huge money-making enterprise. A lot of money is raised around it, and that money is basically coming from corporate sponsorship, whether it's Coca-Cola or Microsoft, and companies after companies put a lot of money into it, and that gives those companies leverage to influence FIFA, leverage to influence governments, and to put their own imprint based on UN guiding principles, what they should do. So we are very lucky that we have Mary and Minky with us. Mary, of course, is Mary Harvey. She's an Olympian. She has taken part in the World Cup. She has got a gold medal for that. And she runs the Center for Sports and Human Rights, with which IHRB is, of course, very closely associated by being one of the founders of that. And Minky is the director of global initiatives at Human Rights Watch. She has worked a lot on China. She has worked a lot on sports and human rights. And she's got a lot of views and to share about how these large mega sporting events operate in a way that's consistent with human rights standards.
Thanks, Salil. Let's hear your conversation with Mary and Minky.
Let's talk about the big picture of progress or illusion. It is the world's most universal game. It is a beautiful game played in every country, watched by billions of people. And yet there has been a very painful history of racism, corruption, and the exclusion of women and minorities. When you look at where the sports stand today, are you genuinely encouraged, or does progress feel more like optics rather than substance? Minky?
Well, I wanted to say that this World Cup was the first with a human rights framework. But of course, this was the first World Cup that was governed by FIFA's human rights policy, which was passed in 2016 and 2017. FIFA took a number of steps after what I think of as the thermonuclear corruption event that detonated their entire leadership. Sepp Blatter, Jerome Valcke, half of the FIFA Exco were taken out of their extremely expensive Swiss hotel in Zurich in sheets and handcuffs. So I think that was the moment when the human rights community, players, fans, the people who really deliver the game, were finally able to pass some reforms within FIFA. And those reforms included non-discrimination and human rights, Article 3 and Article 4 of the FIFA statutes. But this is also against the backdrop of the business and human rights movement around the world. Sponsors of FIFA and others were adopting the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And so this was a once in a generation opportunity to actually force FIFA to adopt a basic international standard that was really becoming the industry standard around the world. The World Cup in 2018 was a competitive process. It was Morocco bidding against the US, Canada, and Mexico, which was really a quite, I hope Mary can speak about this. It was a quite historic bid. It was the first bid of 3 countries. It was a bid that centered human rights, lifting up the rights of players, fans, communities, affected people. And I think it was an opportunity to really for the game to do what Gianni Infantino often claims that FIFA unites the world. There was a vision behind that World Cup human rights framework that this World Cup would really unite the world. I think we've seen that even though there is a human rights framework in place, the host government, particularly the United States, has failed to live up to that human rights framework, and FIFA has not insisted that that government do so.
Mary, half full, half empty?
I would say that awareness of the issues as a result of what Minky has described, and not just by FIFA, but all other actors, the fact that there was a human rights strategy that was done and consultative by design and by requirement, and then shared and is a public document, made that something that, because it existed in the public domain, was something that everyone could reference. And civil society then had scaffolding to then ask for accountability. In other areas, there's a lot of progress. Women's sports taken off like a rocket, which is fantastic, right? And that's wonderful. When it comes to accountability, there's still an implementation gap in a variety of different ways. So when it comes to codes of conduct and the human rights commitments that have been made by FIFA and others, as you get into the heat of an event, I would say the consistency with which those commitments are being applied, I think there's still some progress that can be made, to be candid.
I'm glad, Minky, you kind of anticipated some of what I was going to ask about this World Cup itself. And you were right in saying that because of the human rights framework, this was supposed to be a model, a test case for North America as a model host. But we've seen how hard it has been for the Iranian athletes to stay here and even get visas. Some fans from developing countries not getting visas to enter the country, and other logistical nightmares, and the Somali referee's case, which I mentioned that, he wasn't able to perform the duty. And this is also happens to be during the year of the 250th anniversary of the US as a republic and a democracy and so on. So has the US lived up to its own self-image as a rights-respecting host? Or has 2026 exposed a gap between that rhetoric and reality? How has it handled the process of people having, there was this Congolese case about the man who was talking about Lumumba, symbolic example of that. In each of these cases, there have been stifling of expression of some form or the other has been going on. So if you can reflect on that.
I think it's important that we also discuss the backdrop of this World Cup, because since Donald Trump took over in January 2025, there's a backdrop for this World Cup of violent, visible detentions of immigrants, National Guard deployments across the U.S. cities, ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents, masked with guns, knocking on doors and separating families in the middle of the night, and FIFA's failure to respond to that. And no one imagined in their worst nightmares that there would be a World Cup where months before U.S. citizens were killed in the streets of Minneapolis. So I think we have to say bluntly that this is not a World Cup that appears to be governed by a human rights framework. Ahead of the Club World Cup 1 year before, FIFA canceled its own anti-racism and anti-discrimination campaigns. I think some of the racist attacks that we have seen on athletes might be a result of the effective green light that the Trump administration has given by barring fans of color, by putting in place a visa ban or a partial ban for as many as 39 countries. That's not the welcome mat that anyone had in mind. Omar Artan, the Somali referee, who was the top referee in Africa, handpicked by FIFA, and yet when he was turned away at the border and with allegations that he was somehow involved in terrorist activities, FIFA did not defend his right to be there in his workplace. And I do think it's important that we remember that this World Cup is a workplace for players, referees. It's fans who have been able to attend, the World Cups in Russia and Qatar were also human rights nightmares in their own way, with in Qatar, thousands of migrant workers from South Asia dying preventable deaths, building stadiums and infrastructure. This World Cup was supposed to do better. And I think each country has its own human rights problems, but the World Cup has been a unique showcase for the human rights failings of the United States, which has hosted 78, the majority of the matches, and will host the final soon.
So, Minky, your points are right on. I would say that I'm going to look at it maybe from a different standpoint as you look at the role of the state actor. This is a 48-team World Cup now. And I'm just going to talk about leverage, right? It's the largest event that's ever been staged across a continent. The logistics, the planning, everything that goes into it takes a tremendous amount of work ahead of time. And this was awarded in 2018. So this was 8 years ago. To have such a change happen in beginning of 2025 and then absorb the ramifications of that change. Basically, there is no plan B to relocate the World Cup. I mean, you don't relocate a 48-team tournament with a year out, right? A year and a half out. That is just not possible. So the leverage equation factors into that. Well, okay, if you're FIFA or if you're a sponsor, what do you do with that? I mean, Qatar had, 12 years before the event? And it was a 32-team tournament. This was 8 years, but massive event and a new hosting structure. So I'm not making excuses at all. All I'm doing is shining a light on kind of the reality of the situation that we're in.
Yeah. And you use the word leverage, Mary. So I want to come back to that and ask you first, and then Minky, you can weigh in, which is the whole idea of the business of the beautiful game. Sponsors, broadcasters, kit manufacturers, financial institutions, they're all putting tons and tons of money in football. Have any of them actually used that leverage to advance rights this time or in the past that you know? Or does the money mainly flow in one direction, which is that it gives FIFA the latitude to do what it wants?
Well, I mean, first of all, we're probably never going to know what leverage is actually being applied because it's never going to be something that's done in the public domain, right?
Yeah.
It'll be something that happens privately in bilateral conversations or as a group. There have been previous instances where I think the sponsors coming together have been quite effective. And I was actually part of meetings, for example, in Doha, where the sponsors came together and had questions for the organizers and FIFA about the changes they were making for the tournament based on the work of investigative journalism and others on working conditions. In this World Cup, again, it comes back to the timing. This is a big change, very close into the tournament.
Thank you for the question. And since this is a business and human rights podcast, I'd like to geek out a little bit.
UNGPs, here we come.
And as it happens, Human Rights Watch and the Sport and Rights Alliance, the unions and others. So we wrote to all 19 sponsors ahead of this World Cup, asking them what their process had been and how indeed they were using their leverage. And I want to say that the bar is pretty low since these sponsors literally help pay for this World Cup and bankroll it. They're not really running very many risks in reaching out to FIFA. And so we wrote to all 19 sponsors to ask them to support, among other things, an ICE truce, that fans in communities of color would not face the midnight knock on the door during and after the World Cup. And we got answers from 6 sponsors. These are sponsors, I think, very importantly, that have engaged with the Center for Sport and Human Rights, the organization that Mary's the CEO of. And they actually said, we regularly engage with FIFA on human rights matters relating to this World Cup. So I think what I take from that is there is a positive role to be played by the sponsors if they are prepared to do it. I think that this World Cup is an example in many ways of what not to do. And so I hope that it can be an iterative learning experience for perhaps the next time North America hosts a World Cup. I hope the Women's World Cup in 2031. The sponsors have leverage because they're paying for the event. And they do also have a responsibility to use it. That's what the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights says. And I think it's clear that they were dismayed because Coca-Cola, for example, wants to sell beverages and cold drinks to children. Coca-Cola doesn't want, it's a very bad look if children are being separated from their parents at a FIFA event. So that is the opposite of what they're looking for. And that's not a hypothetical case. Human Rights Watch documented that a father who brought his 10 and 14-year-old children to the Club World Cup used a recreational drone, was arrested, detained for 3 months in an ICE detention facility, and deported. And that all happened at a FIFA event. So that's the opposite of the hope, unity, and human achievement that the sponsors are looking to underwrite. And I hope this will be a profound moment of reckoning that for sponsors, that perhaps a chief executive of FIFA who decides to give a made-up FIFA Peace Prize to Donald Trump at the moment when this cruel immigration crackdown was happening. After FIFA events, generally FIFA announces that it's the best event ever in the history of the world and leaves it at that. I think there needs to be a reckoning from phone calls at the White House to overturn a red card suspension to the FIFA Peace Prize. Have the world's fans, have the players, have the sponsors themselves been well served by FIFA's choices to pander to leaders with repressive human rights policies?
That's a great segue to my next question, which is whether the rights to host an event, should they be made conditional? I mean, this has been talked about for a long time. Beijing in 2000 was an issue when the games ultimately went to Sydney by a narrow vote. Ultimately, Beijing does get to hold the games. But then we've had more and more countries with rather unsavory human rights record getting to host the events. And this was supposed to be not like that because these are supposed to be ostensible democracies. But yet the record of one of the countries has been quite appalling this time. So is it realistic? And if so, how do we set the bar? Is it that the engagement with problematic regimes sometimes end up doing good rather than excluding them?
So theoretically, right, and we believe this at the center, Sporting Chance Principle number 10, that bidding should be open to all. And every country has human rights challenges, and we know that. However, when it comes to human rights challenges for countries that have significant gaps, there is opportunity. And we've seen with labor reform in Qatar, so the other side of it is there's been labor reform, which is not easy to pass. An ILO office set up in Qatar. One could argue that maybe those things don't happen if there isn't the scrutiny and the expectations of hosting a World Cup. But here's the other part of it now. You award a 48-team World Cup, it's going to have to be multiple countries, although 2034, it's one country. It's just a big, big tournament now. And the realities of accountability for non-performance or transigence when it comes to implementation, if that's the ultimate penalty, is moving the tournament or what have you, you can't delay it because of the international match calendar. Like, there's no way you can delay it. So you move it. Again, it's 48 teams, it's 16 host cities. It's not easy. So the reality is that it's challenging. But there has to be accountability for commitments made. And this is where the implementation gap has become a problem. And Minky, you probably have this frustration as well.
Yeah, I do want to say that so Salil, to your point, the maximum leverage on human rights and getting commitments is actually in the bidding phase, because that's when host countries or host country groups are actually under maximum pressure to make promises. And I want to say that FIFA has a professional human rights team that is trying in many cases to get it, just for this specific World Cup, for example, the 16 host cities committed to publish a so-called human rights action plan. And until the days before the tournament, the human rights team was still trying to get them to do this. The reason they didn't want to publish was no one wanted to be attacked by Donald Trump. So that climate of fear is really, again, the antithesis of what you want. No host city wants to have the National Guard show up and ruin their event, but that was a meaningful threat. And it stood in the way of host cities delivering on the one thing they knew they had to do, which was engage with local stakeholders and have the World Cup be a meaningful progress and process so that local communities feel like the World Cup is happening with them, not to them. That was the vision. And I do think that the partner that FIFA chooses matters very much. And I think this model of partnering with autocrats has been disastrous. So let's just look very quickly. Every government, as Mary says, has human rights abuses, some of them serious human rights abuses. But not every government has the kafala system of modern day slavery, building 8 stadiums and $220 billion of infrastructure in the desert. That was Qatar. So the World Cup was awarded knowing what the migrant labor situation was and without protections, and thousands of workers died, and FIFA never paid compensation to those families. So I think this model of partnering with autocrats and places that have disastrous human rights policies, not just bad, disastrous. Workers from North Korea died building the St. Petersburg Stadium. Thousands of workers died in Qatar, and in the United States, hundreds of thousands of families have been separated by ICE. That is a terrible 3 World Cup legacy for FIFA. So the answer is you have to change your partners. Do not partner with autocrats and authoritarians who won't uphold the promises they've made.
So let's turn to the frameworks that can guide this. We have talked about companies. Of course, they have the UN guiding principles, the International Bill of Rights, which applies to the states. And there are sector-specific tools that are also getting developed in many of these instances. So when a company is trying to decide whether to sponsor a tournament or renew a broadcasting contract, what framework should actually apply, and what would their meaningful due diligence look like? Should they be reading more of Human Rights Watch and Amnesty reports? What should they be doing?
We're in the year 2026, and everyone can look on the internet to see, for example, are LGBT people allowed to live and work and exercise basic human rights in a country? Are journalists free to report on corruption and repression in a country? Are the basic conditions in place, i.e. trade unions, transparency of contracts, and a lack of wage theft, are those conditions in place for this event to come off without a disaster? And I would say it is not necessary that all mega events are human rights disaster zones. How many workers died building the London Olympics? It's 0. 0 workers died building a major event in the UK. Why? Because there were trade unions. It's not necessary that tens or thousands of workers die building these events. And so that means you have to recalibrate your standards, and you need to put in place ironclad guarantees, not words on paper that workers won't die. By the way, the first worker has already died on the Aramco Stadium in Saudi Arabia from Pakistan. This is completely unacceptable.
And there will be 15 stadiums for the World Cup 2034, and 11 are going to be new builds. So there's the risk profile, the as-is situation when a country is bidding. That's the starting point. And then you identify, hopefully, the bidding process and the requirements of that bidding process, which are FIFA requirements, ask you to look at the gap between international standards and local laws and practice. And things like kafala pop out, right? They come out and say, yeah, this is, big deviation from the ILO standards. And so as a result of that, that's what the strategy should be based on, the human rights strategy for the event. So you learn a lot in the bidding process by the candor with which the bidders are willing to own that and say, yes, there's work to be done. But that doesn't guarantee that there's going to be implementation and accountability. But at least in the bidding process, and as Minky mentioned, it is the point of maximum leverage that FIFA has is right before the event's awarded, right before, that's the maximum point of leverage for the event owner. And the bid documents are a big part of what they're assessing. And so, and this is just a plug for making an honest swing, if you're a bidder, at the human rights situation in the country that you're bidding for. Is it a candid assessment? How candid are they going to be? In the case of the US, Canada, and Mexico, do you talk about forced disappearances of journalists in Mexico? Does it talk about gun violence in the United States? I mean, you could argue that if you're not talking about these things as a bidder in the risk assessment, either you're unwilling to look at these things or you're unaware of these things and you don't know what you're doing. Either one is not good. But I think that's one of the key things, is that you learn a lot about where a country's at and what they're prepared to do from the bidding documents themselves.
And can I just add that Mary Harvey, when she was working on this bid, delivered a process under an extremely tight timeline of engaging with stakeholders and actually disclosing what the human rights problems are. As we know, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights say that it's not a problem if you have a problem. The problem is when you don't disclose it. And I think Mary, before she was the CEO of the Center for Sport and Human Rights, helmed a process that was honest and led to a landmark human rights strategy that was part of the United Bid. In contrast, for the 2034 World Cup and the 2030 World Cup, FIFA helmed a process which eliminated competitive bidding, eliminated transparency, and awarded Saudi Arabia the highest evaluation score in FIFA World Cup history of 419 points out of 500. FIFA, Saudi Arabia, it said it was building stadiums in cities that don't even exist yet, NEOM. And those stadiums will be built with workers who have their passports confiscated and have no access to human rights and remedy. So there was no way Saudi Arabia deserved that score. So to Mary's point, if you're not honest in the bidding process and FIFA participates in a sham process, the outcome could be catastrophic for the human rights of those workers who will actually deliver this World Cup.
What is it that would take to change things? If there were 1, 2, or 3 things about what FIFA can do, host nations do, or the business communities can do. Otherwise, we are going to return to the same conversation again and again.
Well, I'm an optimist by nature. That's just how I'm built. And my glass is usually always half full, which is not easy to do in the human rights world, particularly now. So I'd like to say that this World Cup is a learning experience in many, many, many ways, and that we can iterate from here. We have a Women's World Cup next year in Brazil, and there's always opportunity. We have the next World Cup 2030. We have the Olympic Games that are coming up in Los Angeles. We have a lot that we're learning about this from this event that's happening right now, from child rights and safeguarding and human rights challenges to policies and what needs to be changed and everything. So that's the optimist in me. I guess the pragmatist in me is, unfortunately, the truth is that most of the big changes, like the Big Bang moment that was in 2015, when FIFA passed a number of changes, was due to calamity, where big change can happen in a short amount of time. In the human rights world, that is a really awful thing that would happen, because that involves egregious harms happening to people or corruption. So I want to say it's going to happen organically and iteratively through events that we learn from and also the event owners learn from. But I think for significant, meaningful, enduring change to happen, calamity usually is where that ends up really facilitating the big changes that need to happen. And that's just unfortunate, but I think it's the reality of what we've seen.
Your final thoughts, Minky?
I'm also an optimist, but working on these mega events will actually turn you into a realist. I wrote an entire book on the possibility that the Beijing Olympics in 2008 could meaningfully improve human rights in China. And I think that failed to reckon with the leadership of Xi Jinping and the repression that has followed. So I think we have to be optimistic and we have to push and think what is the best that could happen. But then we also have to be realistic and protect the most vulnerable communities when harms happen. And if I were to say, what's a single meaningful thing that FIFA could do right now to make amends or to say that it's changing course? They're making billions of dollars from this World Cup in the United States, Canada, and Mexico. That quite a bit of that money should go to compensate the families of the thousands of families of migrant workers who died delivering its last World Cup. So FIFA wants to break with the past and stop pandering to the unreasonable demands of its partners, like the government of Qatar. It needs to actually make amends. And in the business and human rights world, we call that remedy. So there are things that FIFA could do right now that would signal it is prepared to break with this tradition of pandering to the autocrats or human rights abusers that are its partners. There's still time to do that. And I think it would be an important signal for the world that the World Cup will be one that unites the world and doesn't bring harms along with the fun and games.
Despite everything, I think there's a glimmer of hope. And I always want to sort of end on hope. When I'm not in Geneva with the center, I'm home in Seattle, which is one of the host cities. And Seattle is the only host city to observe both Juneteenth and also Pride. And on the Pride match day, you had a full-out stadium, packed. Outside the stadium, you had this mixture of Jehovah's Witnesses preaching that Muslims are going to go to hell and a bunch of other things. You had a pro-regime march with the anti-regime in Iran, a march happening right in front of the stadium next to the Jehovah's Witnesses, and flags that are pretty inflammatory, so the pre-revolutionary flag of Iran. And then you have Pride happening, right? So you have rainbow and you have drag queens, and it all coexisted peacefully. Everybody had their say. And my understanding was that after all of that, we had a wonderful game, and you could see Pride flags from where I was sitting in the stadium, as well as, even though they were not allowed, but they got smuggled in, pre-revolutionary Iranian flags, right? You have all this happen. And my understanding is 0 security incidents. So it's possible.
And FIFA followed its own human rights rules and allowed rainbow flags in the stadium, which was entirely correct.
Yep, it's absolutely right. I had one on me, and it was not confiscated.
No, that's a nice, hopeful note to end on. Thank you so much, Minky and Mary.
Thanks for having us, Salil.
Thank you, Salil.
This is a timely and important topic. Thanks to Salil, Mary, and Minky for this discussion. And thank you for listening to this episode of Voices, which is brought to you from the Institute for Human Rights in Business. Until next time, be sure to share and follow this podcast, that way you will never miss an episode. And if you would like to find out more about the work that we do at IHRB, then head to ihrb.org.